Coming up on 60 Minutes.
Women are only ever been sex workers. That's all women have ever done.
The so-called king of toxic masculinity.
It bears so many hallmarks of a cult.
Andrew Tate says awful things about women.
Basically worked for free. They worked for my love and attention.
Very scary.
So why do millions of young men believe him?
Year 11, I was looking for something to cling on to.
He became your role model.
Absolutely.
Hello and welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm Christine Ahern. A few weeks ago, I sat down with documentary maker Jamie Tahsin. Over a 5-year period, on and off, he spent a lot of time with Andrew Tate, unprecedented access. You would have seen his interview on 60 Minutes where he describes Tate's network as a cult. Here is our full chat.
Jamie, when did you first become aware of Andrew Tate?
It was in late 2019 when I first heard about Andrew Tate. A colleague at work was speaking to me about a friend of hers who was suddenly having an issue with her younger brother. He was 18 years old and had just become completely obsessed with these two brothers from Romania who were getting big on Instagram. What she told me was she didn't know a lot about them. They made some kind of shocking videos on YouTube and claimed to have made a lot of money from being sort of webcam millionaires, running sort of webcam sex industry adjacent companies. And it was completely changing this young man's life. He was becoming obsessed with them. He was beginning to emulate their photos on Instagram. And most worryingly, he had just paid a large sum of money to join something that Andrew Tate was selling called the War Room, which was essentially membership to a secret society that these brothers would be running where they would teach you how to be alpha males like themselves. At that point, Andrew Tate was still pretty much a fringe figure. He had around 50,000 followers on Instagram, but I could see that following was gaining traction quickly, and also the level of devotion his newfound fans were showing him, like this young man literally recreating his Instagram poses, paying thousands of pounds to join his secret society. I started to worry that this might turn into a bigger story, which is where I slid into Andrew Tate's DMs on Instagram, sent him a message, and about 20 minutes later, we were on the phone speaking for the first time.
Well, your intuition was right in terms of how his popularity grew. You decided to travel to Romania to interview Andrew Tate when he wasn't that popular. He only had about 50,000 followers. What was that like?
It was very strange. So the first time Matt Shea, my colleague, and I went to interview Andrew Tate, he was a very different man from the Andrew Tate you might recognize now. He was charming, which some people say he can be still. I don't see it anymore, but he was very charming. He was very self-depreciating. He would make jokes at his own expense. He would say things to Matt and I like, oh, you guys don't need to make loads of money. You don't need fancy cars. You live in London. You've got great public transport. He was this very amiable guy that would occasionally say shocking things in our presence, but when he did, he was often doing it with this glint in his eye, like he knew it was going to offend us. The more time I spent with Tate and the more famous he became, the more I started to see this shift in him where he became much more confident in being forthright with his opinions in a non-comedic way, if that makes sense, but also more devoured and obsessed by the fame. When we then went out to Romania to see him again in 2022, he was very gleeful that week he'd become the most Googled man in the world. And then 2 years after that, when we filmed with him for the last time in Romania, he was saying things to us like, I am the culture, I own the internet, I'm the most relevant man on earth. So it was really quite strange for us because over this 4.5-year trajectory, we managed to see him go from someone who, was obviously incredibly problematic, had worrying allegations around him, but was essentially a fringe internet figure. In that 4.5 years, he sort of blew way beyond what we ever expected he could do and became one of the most famous men in the world and definitely one of the most controversial.
After spending so much time with him, more than probably any other mainstream media has managed to do, what is it about Andrew Tate, do you think, that he gets so many young men to follow him?
I think in some ways it's quite simple. The very first time I spoke to Andrew Tate, he told me, I'm selling the James Bond lifestyle. And that was essentially what his initial marketing ploy to these young men was. He tried to cultivate envy in them. So he would use himself as the archetype of what an exciting manly life should be. You should be traveling the world, you should have multiple sexual partners, you shouldn't settle down, you should be making lots of money, you should be in the gym, you should be fighting, you should only live with other men was another one of his big rules. And it was this very attractive package to some young teenage boys who perhaps felt like their lives were boring. When we were in Romania, there were 100 Andrew Tate fans who had joined his war room who flew out to be there with him for this event. And one thing that one of the 19-year-old members actually said while he was out there that really stuck to me was, this week while I've been in Romania with Andrew Tate, it feels like a movie. And that's what all of our lives should be. They should be like movies. And he's really leaning into that mentality amongst young men. I would say that's where the majority of his young male audience comes from. And then the danger you get from that is the misogyny that Andrew Tate then sells them alongside this sort of hustle culture lifestyle. And the two very much become intertwined the further you get into Andrew Tate's network. I think the best way to describe how a fan's trajectory might change in their time of following Andrew Tate is to think of it as like a multi-level marketing scheme or a cult. So at his very entry level, you might have fans who watch his videos on Instagram, watch his videos on YouTube, engage with him on social media. At the next level, he has a course you can buy called the Hustlers University. It costs $50 a month. It's pretty cheap. And in there, you'll interact with other Andrew Tate members, and they'll teach you how to make money. But one aspect of that is learning how to make money on webcam. And then once you get up to another level, you can pay £3,000 a year to join the war room. And the deeper and deeper you go in, the more the exploitation of women for the purposes of making money becomes central to the thesis of what you're doing there.
After spending so much time with him, what is something that people would be surprised by about Andrew Tate?
I think the main thing is that he can be incredibly charming. And I say this quite often to my friends who ask me, what is Andrew Tate like? I say, if you met him in the pub and you didn't know anything about him, he was just a stranger and he came over and spoke to you, you would end up thinking, that's a really great guy, because he has this incredible ability to mirror people and say the right thing. And it's it's something that the women I spoke to who alleged groomed him touched upon, because they said, we're not idiots. We didn't just fall for this guy who came out saying, I'm a horrible man, I think you're all idiots, I'm going to enslave you. He charmed them, and he's very good at presenting himself as what you want him to be. And I think humor played a part in it early on as well. Andrew Tate is very good at noticing what's happening in meme culture or youth culture online. And he, in fact, employed a bunch of marketing experts, most of whom were sort of 18 to 25 years old, to actually help him building his content to market to young people. And a big part of that was saying very, very shocking things. So, women should be owned by the men that they're married to. Women should have the number of men that they've slept with tattooed on their foreheads so that we're all aware. These are obviously all really shocking and extremely misogynistic comments, but the way he would make them was with a slight laugh or a slight glint in his eye that then would also give not only his teenage fans, a sense that they were doing something that was a bit naughty and pushing a boundary and perhaps taboo, but also sort of gave him a get-out-of-jail-free card in that he could say, well, I'm just joking. I'm just leaning into jokes. You guys can't handle the humor. These are obviously jokes. It's just rhetoric. And I think that's something you see a lot from Andrew Tate now. He constantly says, I'm being targeted because of my words. People are, using the law against me because they don't like the things I say or the way I say it. That's pretty divorced from the truth, but the fact that he's had this humorous tinge running through his content throughout his time has allowed him to use it as an excuse.
Do you actually think that Andrew Tate believes what he's selling, or he's just clocked on that this is a real money-making machine?
Oh no, I believe he believes it. I've spoken to women that knew Andrew Tate back in 2014, 2013, long before he was famous. He was a real sort of fringe kickboxer back when combat sports weren't really a big thing. And they all said he would say incredibly misogynistic things back then. Even back then, they said, one of them told me she vividly remembers a point, his Facebook cover photo was an image of a man with his foot pressed down on a woman's head. And that was his cover photo when he was in his mid-20s on Facebook. And there were other moments where, the mask would slip. So when we met in London one time, I was meeting him at his hotel and we were going to do some filming outside the hotel. So at this point, he wasn't necessarily playing his character, as he might like to say. He wasn't on camera. And I met him in the lobby, and a young woman came down clearly from his hotel room and said, "Andrew, I'm really sorry, I need the key card, I've left something in the room." And without even acknowledging that I was there witnessing this conversation, Andrew just turned to her and said, "Go and speak to the reception, why the are you talking to me?" And then he turned to me and said, "Dumb b****s, am I right?" And I still vividly remember it because the way he said it, there wasn't a hint of, I'm trying to push a boundary to get a reaction from you, or I'm trying to get a laugh. It felt like he really meant it, and he was annoyed that she dare speak to him while he was standing there with a journalist. And throughout my time with Andrew Tate, there were these recurring moments that kind of indicated, yes, he really does believe that women aren't as intelligent as men. Women shouldn't be able to vote. Women should be entirely devoted to their husbands in a sense that they're essentially their slaves. These are all things that Andrew Tate does believe. I think what's most interesting about him is he's managed to convince himself that holding those views is not misogynistic. It's just viewing men and women as different. It doesn't involve any hatred of women, which is obviously ridiculous.
Jamie, what was that like for you, hanging out with someone like Andrew Tate?
It was tough, but I mean, I was kind of walking that line that as a journalist you often have to walk. I think it was particularly hard for Matt, who was the reporter I was working with, because there are so many moments where you want to say, "This is outrageous, Andrew," or "This is demonstrably wrong," and you want to push back in the most forceful possible ways. But you're quite aware that if you do that, there's a good chance he might say, "You're not following me anymore, you're not going to get further into my life, you're not going to get further into the story." So we were constantly having to sort of walk this fine line between pushing back where we thought it was really important to do so, and it was our obligation as journalists to do so, but not pushing so hard that we wouldn't be able to keep investigating over an extended period of time. It was really that extended period of time that allowed us to get further and further into the story.
After COVID lockdowns, his popularity exploded. Why do you think that was?
I think there's a few factors that play a part. One is a fairly rudimentary factor. Young people felt lonelier than ever. They were at home spending far more time looking at their screens. Screen time massively spiked in Europe and America amongst teenage boys. And they were more isolated, which inherently makes you more vulnerable to people looking to exploit you on the internet, right? You're lonely, you're depressed, and you're also spending more time online. I think the other thing that Andrew Tate managed to do quite cleverly was latch on to a lot of the conspiratorial thinking that was emerging in society at that time. Andrew Tate loves to talk about the government selling you a falsehood, whether it's feminism, whether it's democracy, all of these things that they tell you are going to work and make the world a better place. He believes that they're lies created to control you. And when COVID came along, it suddenly became very easy for him to make the argument that governments are tyrannical and governments will lock you in your house if you disagree with what they say is happening. And although we know that there are very reasonable and sensible reasons for why countries around the world were doing this, they were dealing with an unknown pandemic. For Andrew Tate, it became a great way for him to lean on the discontent that young people might be feeling at having to be trapped in their homes. And he also offered them a potential solution, because while COVID lockdown was going on, if you went on Andrew Tate's Instagram, he wasn't locked down. He was traveling around Europe in private jets. He was driving across borders. People were telling him to put masks on, and he was filming himself laughing in their face. And what he would say to his young followers is, if you just become like me, if you get enough money and you get big and strong enough and intimidating enough and powerful enough, this is how you can live your life as well. So it became a very satisfying message for young men who wanted to be doing something more exciting with their lives, couldn't because of the practical circumstances of the COVID lockdown. And then Andrew Tate comes along and goes, buy my courses, do them for a year, and in a year's time, you're going to be so rich, you're going to have so many women that you can live this lifestyle too, and not even a government can lock you down.
Is this a cult?
In my mind, it is a cult, yes. There were multiple things we saw that had real parallels with cults. But the primary aspect of it that is cult-like that I would say is Andrew Tate's War Room. So you pay $3,000 a year to join. I think it's recently actually gone up to $5,000. And while you're there, there is a very organized hierarchical structure. So you have your foot soldiers, who are the guys who pay to join. That's literally what they call them, the foot soldiers. And then you have generals, who are these senior figures appointed by Andrew Tate. And they're these grown men, typically 35 or older, and these men essentially manage the young boys and stay on top of everything that they do. And they create a real insider-outsider divide. So anyone outside of the war room, they call them clown world. That's where the title of our book came from, because they're living in a complete fake reality. That's how they see it. And everyone inside is assumed to be someone who has this superior level of knowledge that has been given to them by this person, Andrew Tate, who essentially becomes like a deity for them. They even refer to his philosophy as Tateism, as though it is like a encapsulating spiritual philosophy. And I think it's essentially an example of what can happen when a cult decides to use social media to market itself rather than real-world interactions. And that online aspect allowed them to grow at a rate that no one has ever seen before, right? He's a cult leader who was essentially broadcasting to everyone around the world on TikTok. But also, when you join the war room, you could spend 20 hours a day talking to these men the whole time. So girlfriends of war room members, now ex-girlfriends of war room members I spoke to, said from the moment he joined, he became lost in his phone. He was on it 20 hours a day, replying to messages, and it was all incredibly important work. So yes, it is a cult. It bears so many hallmarks of a cult. I think Andrew Tate himself would like to think of it as a cult. He'd be very proud to think of himself as a cult leader from what I know of him. There's no reason why it can't be a cult that's propagated on the internet. And I think what Andrew Tate showed is that when you decide to use the internet to start a cult, it can get very, very big, very, very quickly. I mean, you're directly paying Andrew Tate money to learn from him. And to be fair to some war room members, there were a few I spoke to who joined because, you know, they weren't necessarily that interested in the women, but they were like, I'd quite like to be rich. And they joined with these hopes that Andrew Tate would teach them how to be rich. And one of them, he joined with the hopes that he would learn how to make loads of money. But what he tells me he very quickly found out when he joined was that within the war room and within Andrew Tate's sphere, there was really only one way they taught you how to make money, which was by either taking your girlfriend you already have and getting her to work for you on webcam or OnlyFans and give you all the money, or going out there and recruiting women, making them believe that you want to be their boyfriend, when in reality, you're planning to get them to work for you in the sex industry and give you the money. We saw cases of men around the world following this advice and ended up speaking to women in the US, South America, and Europe who had all been groomed by men who were members of Andrew Tate's war room and had learnt directly from Andrew Tate how to do it.
And one of the aims of the war room, or one of the aims that Andrew Tate teaches, is for women to get the name of their boyfriend tattooed on them.
It's hard to imagine what explanation he might have for why he wants to do it, but it's important to note that it's a very common tactic seen amongst human traffickers around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe. I've spoken to legal experts in the UK, I've spoken to members of the Department of Homeland Security in the US who investigate human trafficking, and that's a hallmark that they say they see recurring over and over again. And because these men are alleged of using, in the most part, a non-violent means of grooming, right? They make these women psychologically dependent on them, often financially dependent as well, but particularly psychologically dependent, and have them believing it's a relationship with boyfriend and girlfriend, and this is just something we do. Once those women have that name tattooed on them, psychologically it becomes a lot harder for them to leave, right? And what we saw was Andrew Tate really egged on his war room members to get women to do this for them, and he would brag by sending pictures of the women he had with King Tate or property of Tate or Tate's property or just the word Tate tattooed over them. And it was, you know, not a few women, I'm talking more than 15, probably around 20 women we saw with the name Tate tattooed on them. But what we also saw was other war room members excitedly bragging to their fellow war room members, I finally convinced my girlfriend to get my name tattooed on her. Or that 19-year-old girl who I met in Starbucks last week, who I've got working for me on webcam, she's agreed to get her name tattooed on me. And they were really gleefully bragging about it. And then the other side of it is they were using those photos to help each other out. So one war room brother, as we saw, he basically received a message from another war room brother saying, look, I've got this girl's name tattooed on me. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show it to my girlfriend and say, look, my friend's girlfriend's perfectly willing to get his name tattooed on her. My other friend's girlfriend's perfectly willing to do it. Why wouldn't you do it? Don't you love me? If you loved me, you would do it. So there's a huge amount of emotional manipulation in play as well. So he had 2 courses, video courses, that you can think They're kind of akin to like the masterclass courses, except these courses are essentially human trafficking with Andrew Tate. The first course was Andrew Tate's PhD course, which stands for the Pimping Hose degree, which is essentially his recruitment course. And then the webcam course basically teaches you how to take those women that you've acquired and then convert them into working for you in webcam and giving you all the money. It was incredibly detailed, incredibly calculated, and not only did they give men the blueprint for how to do this, but they then provided essentially customer support while they were going through the process of doing it.
Andrew Tate is currently facing a string of criminal and civil charges. Do you think he is going to face any jail time?
I think, given the evidence I've seen, some of it relating to his Romania investigation, some of it relating to the civil case here in the UK, I think there's definitely a strong argument for why Andrew Tate should face trial for these charges. I know that's something he doesn't think should be happening, but I think considering the evidence we've seen, we should definitely place him in front of a jury. But yeah, there are serious issues when it comes to trying to convict people, not just for human trafficking crimes, but also for rape and sexual assault crimes. I know in Romania it's just a judge, but it partially comes down to the huge burden of proof required, alongside the fact that these are crimes that take place in private, behind closed doors. I think the one thing that will be incredibly interesting when and if Andrew Tate does eventually go to trial is the WhatsApp messages, the communications on his phone, the financial records with these webcam companies. Because from my experience of Tate, he's a prolific phone and internet user. He's on it the whole time. He's constantly messaging people, and he's not very careful with what he messages. He sent things to me that I think he wishes he hadn't sent me. So I can't comment on whether I think he'll do jail time, but I think it would be a real miscarriage of justice if he didn't at least face trial quite soon.
His ex-girlfriend, Brie Stern, is the first to actually publicly put her face to these allegations. How significant do you think that is?
I think it plays a big part in helping other women who may be experiencing similar things, whether it's at the hands of the Tate brothers or other victims, to come forward. What Brie did in going public is very brave. It's never an easy thing to talk about. For victims of these kind of crimes, it's an incredibly traumatic experience that completely upends your life. And speaking out about it publicly it's not something they should ever feel required to do, because society doesn't always treat those alleged victims with the greatest amount of respect, and that's something think we've seen in Andrew Tate's case in particular.
You said that Andrew Tate sent you some messages that he might regret. Can you tell us what they are?
So in 2019 and 2020, before Andrew Tate had been arrested and when we were talking about making this film, he would send me messages saying things like, "Oh, come to Romania, I'll show you the craziest time. I've got mafia connections. I'm like a mafia guy out here," which, to be honest with you, at the time I just thought was sort of a madman bragging, trying to sort of upsell himself to a journalist. Look how great the story is, you have to come. But flash forward to now, Andrew Tate is accused of being very closely linked with two Eastern European mafia brothers. So there were little things like that he would say to me that, again, imply that he perhaps was too braggadocious in his past about things he may have done, and also careless on the phone. I mean, there's a voice note that we published in our first film where Andrew Tate basically says to this woman, "Why is it that I love it so much when you don't want to do it and I make you do it anyway?" Which feels like a fairly careless message for an alleged rapist who's trying to get away with it to leave, but that is what we found on her phone. I mean, Andrew Tate may have another explanation as to why that message was sent, or whatever he may say about it, but I think he may have been careless in some ways. The number one thing you're taught as an Andrew Tate fan is don't trust civil society, don't trust journalists, don't trust politicians, don't trust the police, they're all lying to you. So when someone like the BBC or Vice or 60 Minutes come out and say something about Andrew Tate, making allegations against him, for his followers, all that really does is double down in their view that Andrew Tate is right, because Andrew Tate's told them, the media are liars and they're going to lie about me. They're going to lie about me. So then when we publish stuff about them, whatever we publish, his followers immediately think it's a lie, because that's the world he's created in their heads. So there have been a few instances throughout my time reporting on Andrew Tate where I have had messages from fans who said, I used to follow this guy, and then I watched your film and I thought, God, I can't possibly do that. Or I heard testimony from this woman, I thought, God, I can't possibly follow that. But I would say I've encountered far more Andrew Tate fans who walk up to me in the street and say, why did you lie about Andrew Tate? Why are you lying about him? Why are you trying to ruin a good man?
What's the matrix that Andrew Tate talks about and preaches about?
The matrix is us. We're part of it. So the matrix is, like I said, it's the government, it's the media, it's wealthy, liberal billionaires. I think what's quite interesting about Andrew Tate is he tells you that there is this cabal of men who are trying to control the world and keep you imprisoned, and there's a new world order and they don't want you to be free. But he's also quite happy to, suck up to the President of the United States and Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. He's quite happy to suck up to these men who perhaps really are running the world and do really have an impact on how your life is. But what he will tell his fans is they're not actually the Matrix. The Matrix is George Soros, it's the British government, it's COVID. It's all of these things that stop you from living life as you want to live it, as he perceives it. That is the Matrix. And what the Matrix does from his perspective is it tells any lie it needs to do to survive, and it destroys any enemy who threatens it. So what Andrew Tate sells himself as is, for those who've seen the film, he says, I am Neo. I am the guy who is here to bring down the Matrix. And that's why they're lying about me so much, because they don't want you to be free. I just want you to be free. He wants to control his followers' minds and have them see the world in an entirely different way from how it is in reality, because that's where he can craft his own narrative. He calls it his own custom-made reality, is how Andrew Tate refers to it. So what the Matrix is, from his view, is the external forces that are trying to control young men and make them live lives that they won't be happy with. And he's the person who can free them from it. And the way he's going to free them from it is by getting them lots of money, getting them lots of women, which somehow will help, but also fighting for what he calls free speech, your ability to say and do whatever you want without the government getting involved.
Tate has influence right around the world, including here in Australia, influence over boys in classrooms. What do you think it is about him that he actually manages to have this kind of power over boys on the other side of the world?
I think social media has kind of broken down those international boundaries of influence. So if you can get big on TikTok, it doesn't matter what specific country you're located in, you're big on TikTok and everyone around the world's going to see you. I think also, Andrew Tate is from something we call the manosphere, this like broader world of online figures who talk about the men's rights movement or pickup artistry or any one of these sort of subjects relating to women. But he's probably the first member of the manosphere who's been conventionally an alpha male in terms of physique, looks, and lifestyle. Prior to Andrew Tate, most manosphere influencers were kind of, out of shape, older men, pretty much living in a basement somewhere in like Thailand or Japan, just live streaming from a bad webcam. Whereas Andrew Tate came along and he was espousing manosphere views, but he was also 6'3". He also had a diamond Rolex. He also drove around the world, and he had lots of seemingly attractive women around him at all times. And I think the two things combined became an incredibly potent mix for young men who are facing an epidemic of loneliness. We've got, youth suicide amongst young men is the highest it's ever been. There is a real problem there. And I think what Andrew Tate would say is like, that's why I need to exist, because this problem exists. But in my mind, he's actually exacerbating the problem, because what he tells those young men to do is to become more and more isolationist and care about themselves and the accumulation of money and the accumulation of women over anything else which may actually bring them happiness or fulfillment in their lives.
Tate was banned on social media for a time. He's been allowed back on X, courtesy of Elon Musk, and he's recently had a resurgence. Why do you think that is?
I think X is a great platform for Andrew Tate in the sense that hate seems to spread very fast there. And the algorithm clearly has no issues in preventing potential hate speech from being spread. So it's an app on which he can act freely. But I also think he felt incredibly emboldened by the election of Donald Trump. And this isn't me trying to say that, Donald Trump is anywhere akin to Andrew Tate. But when Donald Trump was elected for his second term, Andrew Tate tweeted, it's men versus gays and chicks, which was basically how he saw the election. He saw Donald Trump's victory as a victory for men against women and liberals everywhere. And what was interesting to me watching that on election night was that I'd been following Tate for all this time. I'd been following his war room. And for the 4 years leading up to that election, they were calling it a gender election. They were like, this election is going to be one where all other boundaries of what you might view yourself as slip away. You're no longer going to be black or Hispanic or working class or lower class. It's going to be about men versus women. So when Andrew Tate saw Donald Trump win, for him it was a victory for men and a victory for his kind of intellectual thinking. And because of that, I think he felt emboldened to create more content and spread it further, but also really try and put out an olive branch to Donald Trump. If you go on Andrew Tate's Twitter and search the word Trump, you'll see endless tweets of him just praising Donald Trump, because he, I think, is hoping that Donald Trump will save him. You know, he's got this criminal investigation in Romania, allegations in the UK, 21 incidents in the UK that they want to bring him over to investigate him for a criminal trial. He's also got a civil case involving 4 women. So he's been both emboldened by him, but also very subservient to him in the hopes that he will do something to get him out of this legal issue.
Donald Trump said, oh, look, he had nothing to do with Andrew Tate being allowed to come to America, but how close do you think those two are?
It's impossible to say exactly how close they are, but what I can say is that people that Andrew Tate is demonstrably very close with are also very close to Donald Trump. So there are these really direct links between Andrew Tate and then figures close to Trump. I couldn't comment on whether Trump has ever even met Andrew Tate, whether he knows him personally. But what I would say is that Donald Trump knows that Andrew Tate's audience is most likely to be his audience. Out of all the presidential candidates that could come along, if you're an Andrew Tate fan and you're going to vote for someone, it's probably going to be Donald Trump. So he's very, I think, reluctant to criticize Andrew Tate because they sort of exist in the same world. I think Donald Trump, although he might be savvy enough to know that it's probably not a good idea to actually spend time with Andrew Tate or be too complimentary of him, I think he also won't be too critical because he knows there's this demographic of young men who are likely to vote for Donald Trump who also love Andrew Tate, and it's not worth criticizing him.
What has exposing Andrew Tate cost you?
I mean, a lot of time. It was a story that just kept getting bigger and bigger as we investigated. And I would say there were points where you feel so mentally exhausted by it. I think the main thing was in the short period after each film came out and then the book came out, we would have this incredibly angry audience of young men sending us death threats, saying, I'm going to find where your family live, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And it was quite anxiety-inducing. It was quite anxiety-inducing, to be honest. But I think it was such an important story that we just knew we had to go on reporting on it. Every month we spent on the story, we found some other shocking, horrifying allegation. But what we also saw in that same month was that he got more fans and he got more famous.
Do you think Tate's influence is growing or shrinking?
I think it's an interesting question where I would say his direct influence in terms of the number of fans he himself has is probably shrinking. I think it gets harder and harder each day to become an Andrew Tate fan. But what Andrew Tate has done to the culture is growing, is what I would say. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is the shifting of the Overton window, and it's something that Andrew Tate himself very proudly told me he'd done. He believes that he has moved the parameter on what is socially acceptable to say around the world, both in political senses but also specifically about women. Things that you wouldn't have dared say in 2014, in 2025 you can say it however you like. That's what he thinks he's done. But also what he's done was create this generation of sort of mini Andrew Tate influencers who are going out there and spreading more misogynistic content and gaining their own audiences. And some of those guys he directly trained. They came specifically from within his war room. But then there's also the other side of it where Andrew Tate basically showed young men who want to be influencers that being a misogynist was a good financial model. It was a good route to go down because he would go out there and say abhorrent things and sell courses teaching you how to get women to work for you in the sex industry. And look what happened to him. He became one of the most famous men in the world. He got billions of views, seemingly lots of money, and he's living a life that lots of these young men who want to be influencers want, that he has the life they want.
How dangerous do you think this man is?
I think he's incredibly dangerous, not just because of the severity of what he says, but also the scale of his reach. So there's this whole generation of young men who look at Andrew Tate and go, not only is misogyny something that's acceptable, but it's also a route to becoming rich and famous. I think for some of his key fans, there's probably nothing that you can do. Even a successful criminal conviction would just have them believing that he's been falsely imprisoned, and it's quite common for human trafficking and sexual assault cases to take a long period of time. But what it allows Andrew Tate to do is sow this idea that it's a rubbish case, right? If they had an argument to make, I'd be in prison already, but I'm not. That's what he always says. So it really allows him to create himself as a kind of martyr if things don't go his way. I would like to think that the majority of sensible, reasonable people in this world already do find him abhorrent and disgusting. I think the issue we're going to have is what do we do about the minority that don't view him that way? And as much as having spent 4 or 5 years with Andrew Tate himself and all of his closest fans should probably put me in a position to be able to answer that question, it's not actually an answer I have, because they're so far gone, so many of them. They've detached themselves from their families, friends, left relationships, and entirely devoted themselves to this one man. It's really, really hard to pull someone out of that.
When you saw Andrew Tate on Big Brother, did you ever think this was a guy that was going to have so much influence in the world?
I don't think anyone did. I mean, at that point in his career, he was essentially a failed reality TV star. But I think what that experience on Big Brother does show you is what Andrew Tate's aims were, which were to become famous. He's been obsessed with becoming famous his entire life. And he's finally got that, but at a fairly extreme cost.